Okay, folks, good afternoon and happy Wednesday. Welcome to our May Revenue Roundtable on fair share taxes. Before I start, I wanted to touch on some light housekeeping. First, the last 10 to 15 minutes of this session will be a Q&A. We will be recording the presentation part of the session, but not the Q&A. The slides that we're using today will be shared out along with some additional resources after the session. And then just as a heads up, we will be taking a break in June and we will be returning likely in July, but keep an eye out for that. We'll also be changing the time and dates for future revenue roundtables. So also just keep an eye out for that and we will keep you informed as things develop. So those are just our housekeeping bits. So yeah, thank you so much for coming and let's get to the next slide. I'm really excited for this revenue roundtable. We have two fantastic guests. Speaking today, we have Ryan Tipping, the Director of Policy and Strategy at the Maine Center for Economic Policy, as well as Dr. Phineas Baxandall, the Director of Research and Policy Analysis at the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. And they're going to be talking about their state's millionaires taxes and just fair share taxes generally as well. Next slide. So the agenda today is that I'll be giving the introduction into fair share taxes, providing some background on where Ohio stands, and discussing how this conversation is gaining traction nationally. Then I'll hand it off to Ryan to discuss the millionaire's tax in Maine, and then Phineas will speak about the tax in Massachusetts. Next slide. So I want to start this conversation by grounding it in why it matters. These are two photos from events I attended over the past 2 weeks. The image on the left is from Parents United for Public Schools, gathering at Cleveland Heights University Heights School Board meeting last week. And the image on the right is from Day Without Childcare, organized by the Care Economy Project. Why am I starting with these images? Because these are communities showing up and advocating for funding for services that are pillars for their community and everyday life for Ohioans. Childcare and public schools were both underfunded in our last state budget. And at the same time, Ohio passed a flat income tax and directed $600 million in unclaimed funds to support a new stadium for the Cleveland Browns. We are in the middle of an affordability crisis. As Ohioans struggle to pay for childcare, healthcare, housing, and groceries, it is irresponsible to continue underfunding the public services that people rely on, while also cutting taxes in a way that disproportionately benefit the wealthiest among us. And so that's why this conversation on fair share taxes is so important. It is about priorities. It's about whether we invest in the things that make communities, our schools, our care systems, and our infrastructure work for us, or continue to shift that responsibility onto working class families. It's not just happening here in Ohio. Across the country, states are grappling with these same questions. How to build tax systems that are more equitable, sustainable, and better aligned with the needs of everyday people. And so that is the conversation we're going to be having today. Next slide. And so I know a lot of folks may already be very familiar with this graph, but it comes from our Great Ohio Tax Shift 2026 report. And it shows the combined impact of Ohio's major tax changes since 2005 and how they've disproportionately benefited the wealthiest Ohioans. Only one group is paying more today than 20 years ago. Ohioans making under $26,000 a year. So that's the lowest 20% in income. And they'll be seeing an average tax increase of $32 in 2026. Meanwhile, the highest income Ohioans, those in the top 1% earning over $753,900 annually, are paying nearly $69,000 less per year than they did in 2005. And so the picture is clear. Ohioans with the most wealth have been the primary beneficiaries of a majority of tax cuts passed since 2005, while those with the least have had little to no benefit from these policy changes. And this has had real consequences for the services that everyday Ohioans and their communities depend on. Ohio cannot equitably fund the crucial services and infrastructure that people rely on because our legislature has chosen to shift their responsibility for funding those resources away from the wealthiest, the most able to contribute, onto low and moderate income families. Next slide. And so we've just seen how tax changes have affected each of these groups over time, but it's But to really understand why these differences matter, we need to understand a few key terms to describe how taxes are structured across different income levels. Specifically, we're going to be talking about whether tax policies and systems are regressive, proportional, or progressive. These concepts help us make sense of the patterns we just saw, and they'll be important as we continue looking at how taxes are distributed across Ohioans. So first, regressive taxes. These take a larger share of income from people with lower income relative to what they earn. Proportional taxes are applied at the same rate to everyone, regardless of income, so everyone pays the same percentage. And then finally, progressive taxes increase with income, meaning higher income households pay a larger share of what they earn. Next slide. So after defining those kind of types of ways of taxation by regressive, proportional, progressive, let's take a look at how it actually shows up in practice. This is ITEP's 7th edition of its Who Pays report, and is looking at Ohio taxes as a share of family income in 2024. Looking at a share of income is important because it connects taxes to people's ability to pay rather than just focusing on dollar amounts alone. And so I'll note this this report was released 2 years ago. So there may be some changes since then. What you'll see here is that taxes as a share of income decreases as income increases, meaning that lower income families are paying a larger share of what they earn in taxes than higher income households. And if we look more closely at the income tax, it was one of the few pieces of the system that increased with income. But Ohio's shift to a flat tax has removed that progressive element. And it matters because progressive income taxes help offset more regressive taxes like the sales and property tax. And while the property tax has somewhat shifted due to legislation passed last year, those changes were not targeted to provide relief to Ohioans that need the most, so they don't really address the regressive nature of the system overall. Next slide. And so we've seen how taxes are currently distributed in Ohio, and we've defined what it means for a system to be regressive, proportional, et cetera. And so the next natural question is, what would a more balanced and equitable tax system look like? And that brings us to the idea of fair share taxes and what we mean by a fairer tax code. One where contributions are more closely aligned with people's ability to pay, and where revenues are used to support communities and households most affected by regressive policies. And so I wanted to give a few examples of what fair share taxes could look like. And, we have our speakers that are going to delve into how their states passed policies to kind of make their tax systems more fair. But there's different things we can do. One is to pass more of a to have graduated income tax rates. And Ohio had some version of this before a flat tax, although if you go back far enough in time to I think even 20 years ago, we had, I believe, 9 rates compared to the 3 that we had before the flat tax. And so having those graduated rates ensures that contributions increase with ability to pay. You can tax capital gains like wages in Ohio, and Ohio does do this, and it ensures that taxing wealth is kind of on par with taxing income from wealth is on par with taxing income from work. Although there is currently a measure to try and kind of eliminate that at the moment. And I will say, some states like Massachusetts actually tax wealth more than they tax income from work. And so it's something that, different states can do differently. You can close corporate loopholes. You can tax luxury or high wealth kind of things, which are targeted taxes on high value assets or high end consumption, like luxury real estate or private jets, ensuring that those with the greatest resources contribute more. And you can pass something like an estate tax. And so there's just multiple ways that you can create a fairer tax system. And what you can do with that revenue is you can also create a fairer tax code through implementing things like an earned income tax. Ohio has one, but it's not refundable. And you can implement a property tax circuit breaker, which means that folks who are seeing a larger percentage of their income go to property tax receive a credit paid for by the state to offset kind of that, to offset that cost, but allowing the localities to still collect that tax. You can pass a child tax credit, sales tax credit, and you can exempt certain things from the sales tax, like groceries or medicine, things that kind of everyone uses and that can be more expensive for low-income households. And so that's to say you can collect the revenue and then you can put it back in a way that makes sure that households that are most affected by regressive tax policies find a source of relief without stripping away the funding for services. Next slide, please. So let's zoom out and look at how Ohio compares to the rest of the country. This map shows how state tax systems are structured, ranging from most regressive to not regressive, and many of the states that are red have no income tax. As you can see, many states, including Ohio, fall into regressive categories. This tells us that Ohio is not alone, but it also highlights that some states have made different policy choices and achieved a more equitable tax system. It's also important to note that this map is 2 years old. And so since then, Ohio has implemented a flat tax, which likely moves it further toward the more regressive end of the spectrum. And in contrast, Washington has adopted a millionaire's tax and increased their capital gains tax, steps that might shift it towards a less regressive position. In other words, if this map was updated today, we would likely see some states, including Ohio and Washington, move to different categories based on these policy changes. The key takeaway should be that these outcomes are not inevitable, the result of policy decisions, and they're policy decisions that can be changed. Next slide. So let's take a look at some states that have made or proposed progressive personal income tax policy changes. And so some states that have done so recently are New Jersey, Massachusetts, Maine, Washington, and Minnesota. And they've done so in different manners, with some states, increasing or implementing a millionaire's tax. And I think like Minnesota is the only state that's done this so far, but they've implemented a 1% surtax on high investment income over $1 million. So different states have these are states that have done this since 2020, just to say this is a encapsulation of some large level policy moves around the personal income tax since then. And some states are considering making changes to make their tax system more progressive, including California, Colorado, Virginia, and Rhode Island and Minnesota. And, these changes kind of vary from vary state to state in terms of what they're trying to achieve. I know in Colorado, they have a flat income tax and are looking to bring in a more graduated income tax. And in Minnesota, they are looking to establish a 1% tax on all taxable wealth over 10 million. But the thing is that different states are trying to address kind of the regressivity of their tax systems. And we're seeing a lot of momentum at the moment. So far, we've talked about what a more equitable tax system could look like and how different states have made the policy choices to get there. So now I'm really excited to turn it over to our speakers who bring firsthand experience from states that have taken different paths to adopting a millionaire's tax. One through the state budget process and another through a ballot initiative led by voters. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan from the Maine Center on Economic Policy. To you, Ryan.
Thanks. I appreciate the introduction. My name's Ryan Tipping. I work at the Maine Center for Economic Policy. I'm up here in Orono, Maine. Actually, right now I'm in our state's capital, Augusta. And we are an organization here in Maine that works on economic policy, tax and budget issues, worker justice issues, a whole host of issues at the State House and beyond. And we are also the conveners of the Mainers for Tax Fairness Coalition, which is a coalition that brings in a lot of different voices to the fight for tax fairness here in Maine. So I'm going to go over the policy details, a little bit of the political context here in Maine, how we got to the path we took, a little bit about some of the lessons we learned and some of the arguments we heard along the way. I'm going to drop a whole chunk of links here. I'll reference some of them as I go, but feel free to meander through as I talk. So just the setting for the state, we in Maine are kind of a purple state. We had our last full Republican control of state government back in 2011, 2012. And that's where we saw some pretty hard income tax cuts for the wealthy that created some pretty big holes in our budget and hurt a lot of populations, from towns trying to pay for schools to people trying to get access to the retirement they paid for. A whole bunch of people felt the harm. And since then, there has been a push to try and rebalance the tax code in the right direction. So one of the ways we tried to do that back in 2016, and I say we because I've been in this movement in a few different capacities. I started out as a community organizer back in 2008. In 2012, I ran for office here in Maine and served in the State House of Representatives for 8 years, including 4 years as chair of the House Chair of the Taxation Committee. And then I've been with Maine Center for Economic Policy since 2020. But in 2016, we attempted a referendum, the same path that our colleagues from Massachusetts are going to talk about a little bit later, the Stand Up for Students campaign, which was a surcharge on income over 200,000, rather than talking about the millions. That actually passed and almost went into law. I guess it was technically law for a little while, but didn't actually come into effect. But it was almost immediately overturned by the state budget process because there was divided government. There was a governor in charge who was absolutely against it. And the legislature did away with that surcharge while keeping some of the funding of where it was supposed to go, which was to education. While under Paul LePage, the Republican governor who was governor here for 8 years, we did see some advancements in tax fairness, a lot of changes under the hood, creation of the sales tax fairness credit, creation of other credits that are refundable and actually help people at the bottom who need it most, while also pushing back on some of the increasing attempts to cut income taxes for the wealthy. In 2018, the state swung in the other direction. There was a Democratic trifecta elected, and Maine has had a majority of Democrats in the House and the Senate and the governor's office since then. But the governor that was elected, Governor Janet Mills, has been staunchly opposed to any progressive taxation, whether that's looking at corporations, looking at wealthy individuals, some sort of wealth tax or income tax changes, and has been pretty much a brick wall in terms of coming to committee to testify against these bills, and in fact vetoing some compromises that even had bipartisan support. Our coalition was launched in 2021, and the Mainers for Tax Fairness Coalition, which I encourage you to go to the link there and check it out. It's a group of between 20 and 30 organizations, from teachers, environmental groups, immigrant groups, healthcare related groups, a pretty wide array of people, many of which would be considered unusual suspects when it comes to talking about tax fairness. And that's the goal, really bring people who understand the unmet needs in our society, equipping them with the right strategies and the right data and the right talking points to actually talk about this and push for it in an effective manner. And we've been fighting for tax fairness since that coalition started. Our organization and many others in Maine have been fighting long before that as well. But after that coalition was formed, we saw record surpluses, and we continued to build the coalition, but it was hard to make the argument for increasing taxes on the wealthy, even if it meant balancing the tax code in other places, while at the same time we were seeing record amounts of budget surpluses. But that changed in this past legislature. 2 years ago, we started seeing some holes open up in the budget. At first, because of just changing economics, and then the big ugly bill passing in DC, tearing holes in our safety net and how we pay for things like food assistance and healthcare. So that leads us to the campaign that we fought over the last 2 years to get this passed through the legislature. And there have been other discussions around referendum process or through the legislature. and our allies have used, both to be good paths to victory. But in this case, we decided to push hard for a legislative win, even with a governor that was opposed. Um, the policy that we're talking about today is, 2% income tax surcharge on income over $1 million, $1.5 million if you're filing jointly or you're a head of household. And that is what finally passed in the supplemental budget at the end of this last session, just in April of this year. We didn't start out with that exact policy, and what was that policy originally was supposed to pay for isn't what it was necessarily paying for at the end in the supplemental budget. But we did have a strategy where we wanted to provide options for the legislature to have progressive income sources available to them to close the holes that we knew were going to be there. We initially started with a raft of policy proposals. You can go to the Maine for Tax Fairness website, mainersfortaxfairness.org, and check out the resources tab. You'll see some of the other bills that were alive, and there's some others that aren't even up there anymore, whether that's cap gains, other bills that would adjust our tax brackets, and one bill that actually received quite a bit of bipartisan support around increasing our corporate income, our top rate for our corporate income tax. Those were meant to, continue to push the issue and provide multiple avenues to the same general win. But, a lot of those in the coalition definitely saw the millionaire's tax as the best political and one of the best policy wins to bring real fairness to our income tax code and raise money for things we care about. Like I said, the specific investments that the bill originally started with, it was supposed to go into education, but the argument all along for a lot of people was that these bills are viable opportunities to protect the things we care about. And when we're looking at holes in our safety net, the legislature should consider them opportunities. It's hard to say this went to these exact pieces because it was in a complicated supplemental budget. But we do know, it's going to plug some of the holes I've already talked about. Also increase investments in our property tax fairness credit, which is a refundable credit for low-income folks. It's more for seniors, but it's also now a substantial amount for those under 65. And it also is available to renters as well. So I dropped a couple links to some articles there from the Maine Morning Star, which is a great news source here in Maine. And we did a lot of organizing last year when this bill was introduced, along with a number of the other Mainers for Tax Fairness priorities. We fought hard for it to be included in the biennial budget last year. It didn't quite make it over the line. But, we kept fighting. This is the final year of the Mills administration. There's a whole bunch of other folks running for governor right now. I think there's somewhere around 15 of them at the moment. And we thought, we should push as hard as we can. And there's a chance. The current governor, like I said, she's been opposed to these policies, but up until very recently, she was in a very tough primary fight in her campaign for U.S. Senate against an oyster farmer named Graham Plattner with a very progressive slate of issues in his platform, including tax fairness. And we think that, along with a number of other opportunities opening, gave us a path to victory here. So let me just say that's my biggest takeaway that we've been talking about internally and externally is you have to build an infrastructure. You have to build a coalition that trusts each other to make moves and change course, but also speak with one voice at times and speak with a whole bunch of voices at other times. You have to have a coalition that has capacity to be engaged, whether that's the capacity of their volunteer base to speak about taxes or the just, general capacity of organizations to have organizing staff to turn people out. Uh, and you have to have unusual voices in your coalition able to break through what can otherwise be like a pretty simple narrative of people over here say this, people over there say that. When we started getting a lot of partners that don't normally talk about taxes, whether that was uh, Planned Parenthood or environmental groups or other people, we were able to um, have a bigger impact than just a bunch of policy wonks talking about marginal tax brackets. Um, so I think being prepared and continuing to build on losses, um, even when your policy agenda doesn't make it all the way to the end, building the capacity in your coalition base and in your legislative champions, or if your plan is through a referendum, your grassroots network and your grass tops communicators, using every fight, even if it's destined to not win, is um, a an important part. Being ready for a win, even if you don't expect the opportunity to pop up. Um, I think the other piece that we really value here at the Maine Center for Economic Policy is rooting this in good data, but telling the story through values and real people. We can. I've shared the same ITEP chart for Maine many, many times, and it is important and it is good. But for a lot of people, that information is not necessarily what moves someone to action. Making sure that they understand whether that's heating assistance in a state with brutal winters, food assistance, access to healthcare, or a small business being able to stay open. It's important to talk about these issues in ways that actually resonate with people, but the policy and the initial debate in good data. So yeah, I have a lot more to say, but I think I'll just leave it there unless there's anything else in particular you want covered.
I think that, thank you so much, Ryan. We're going to leave some space at the end for folks as well to ask questions. But before that, we have Phineas, Dr. Phineas Baxandall from the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center here as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Phineas to talk about the millionaire's tax in Massachusetts. Take it away, Phineas. Phineas, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you now.
great. Excellent. So thank you for having me here. And I'm always pleased to talk about the kind of experience that happened in Massachusetts. One of the things that may strike people is just how long the process and preparation was around this. But so I'm going to talk about the Massachusetts millionaire's tax, sort of the context, the debate, and what have been the results since it passed in 2022. So with that, going to the first slide here, um, the the context and the real challenge. It's sort of a 110-year story almost because what happened in Massachusetts was it was a state, one of the early states for having an income tax. And when it was created, there was a big constitutional convention. And they considered a bunch of big changes. They considered whether women should vote, and they decided that was a little that they were not yet ready for that, but they were ready to introduce a state income tax, but they were not ready. They were still uncertain about it. So what they did is they said that if there was going to be a state income tax, there had to be uniform rates across the population. There couldn't be graduated income tax like we know now at the federal level. And at various times, there were challenges to overturn this, even though it's a very involved process to change our state constitution. There were efforts in 1932 and 1962 and 1968, and then most recently in 1994 before this more recent effort. So there was a kind of a long path towards this. And the 1994 had lost, I think it was 73% or something like that, no. And it it was a sort of real resounding defeat for changing this. And so folks were very careful in the process of trying again. And as you can see from the next slide, that this is what came up with. And so the first thing that should strike you here is just how short the policy is. That anytime that people are explaining things and getting into complexity, it is something that makes people adverse. So uh, the one strategy was just to make sure that this is something that could fit on a relatively short paragraph. And the policy itself, as you can see, is a 4% addition on all income over $1 million. And a 4% increment is a relatively larger increment than has happened in a lot of other kind of millionaire tax introductions, but it also had this kind of 100-year lag in the policy change. So it was one where from that point of view, it made sense that it was a relatively larger increment of a full 4%. Uh, Something else that might strike you here is just that it is dedicated. So it is dedicated to education and transportation. And lastly, that it's inflation adjusted. So it's actually now about a 1.1 million is the threshold. I should say, I realize I should have said at the top, uh, Mass Budget, the organization I'm from, the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that is in our fourth decade now of providing research and analysis to policymakers on the Commonwealth's budget and tax situation and policies to try and improve those policies for the Commonwealth. And we came into this process early in kind of looking at what the different revenue possibilities were at different thresholds and at different rates. And uh, and it was a long process, as you can see from the next slide, that the campaign was organized. It had extensive preparation for what was going to be the best approach and kind of crafting the best policy from the point of view of what was going to make sense to the public and what was going to provide the necessary kind of revenue to really make a difference in Massachusetts. So remember, this passed in 2022, so being officially launched in 2014, that's extended. That's an extended process. And it was partly because this was a process that was supposed to end in 2018. It takes 4 years to change the Massachusetts Constitution. We have 2-year sessions, and you need to have uh, a certain number of legislators say that it's okay for it to go to the ballot, and that needs to happen again then the next session. So in two successive 2-year sessions, there has to be this kind of level of approval from the legislature just to let it go to a vote on top of all of the other signature gathering requirements and the validation for the Attorney General that it is a sound question, etc. And what happened in 2018 was there was a requirement that the elements in the ballot question be sufficiently related to each other. And I think it was a surprise to most people that a largely new court had decided that the elements of it were not sufficiently related to each other, that the tax part and the spending part were not as fused together as like a gas tax on a transportation spending, that so it had to be reintroduced in a slightly different path where different rules apply to it. I can get into the weeds on that if people want, but basically there was a legal challenge which succeeded, so it had to go back to the drawing board. So it gets relaunched in 2018, and then COVID happens, and COVID didn't change the process of the mechanics of the ballot question in a formal way. But as you folks may have remembered in Ohio, it definitely had impact for the immediate kind of finances of the state. I believe Ohio probably had a kind of a massive infusion of federal funds like we did in Massachusetts. We may have done different things with it, but what it did is it changed the whole nature of the debate midstream, where um, the debate focused initially more on all of our impending deficits, and then suddenly we had this unprecedented amount of money coming into our state budget through these federal sources, and so much so that the governor was even sending people checks, kind of refund checks that were said because the state had too much money at that moment. It was a very difficult context to connect what the Fair Share Amendment would be doing, this ballot question, what it would be doing compare relative to the immediate in that moment kind of needs of the state. It made the debate have to be more about the sort of longer term budget situation, which is always more abstract for people, and also about just issues of tax fairness, which are also more abstract. So that was a real kind of challenge for the campaign that was running this ballot question. The ballot question you can see here is called here the Fair Share Amendment was what it was most known as, or the Massachusetts Millionaires Tax. The It continues to be called in official documents and such fair share spending. Uh, the millionaires tax, people will still refer to it too, but we tried to sometimes avoid that just because uh, millionaire technically is about wealth and this is about income. And so people can have a misunderstanding. They may think, oh, I may one day inherit my uncle's beach house, which is worth almost $1 million, and think that the tax would therefore um, appeal to them. So uh, we tended to just refer to it in what the campaign was calling it the Fair Share Amendment, and now it gets continues to be called the Fair Share Surtax or just the Millionaires Surtax. But there was a lot of kind of myth busting that happened in that final year or so, where people you may have heard this, also similar stories from Ryan just now, but uh, it's always kind of amazing how much, even though this tax really only applies to, you can say to people, whatever the number is that you put on the bottom of your taxes, that's what it includes. And those are the deductions, those are the kinds of inputs for it. People still really don't understand taxes. And so that's a real challenge. People don't understand the idea of graduated taxes, where it only applies starting with your second million. That's a kind of a concept which doesn't necessarily get to people. So they just hear, oh, 4% income tax increase. Um, or people don't understand, wait, does this also apply to capital gains? What does that mean for my home sales? That was a big kind of myth that was out there, that opponents had really talked about this as if it was going to affect anybody whose home might be $1 million, or whose home sale with their ordinary income might exceed $1 million, something which is is not at all the case because capital gains works only on the increase between what you bought it for and the sale price. And then there's a $500,000 for a couple deduction from what that gain was. And then you can also deduct everything you put into the house during that time. But we had to really show people, and we had to go back and sort of find real estate data that showed just how few houses would reach $1 million threshold. And it was incredibly small. Even the number of communities that had any houses that would have residents that would be affected just from a house sale on the tax. There was also talks about how this would affect small businesses because people who get their business income through a pass-through entity and sort of thinking that that meant that all of the revenue that a business got would count towards this tax, all kinds of misunderstandings that had to be addressed. And often um, in trying to address these, or the campaign were not as loud or not as always well backed in making that case or kind of addressing those misunderstandings. But the eventual vote, which had started off as being a very wide margin, I think this is true a lot for ballot questions, that if they don't start with 60% or so support, they'll never get there. But here there was also the additional kind of problems with COVID having changed the debate and the kind of complexities understanding around taxes that ended up winning by just a little over kind of 2% when it finally got to the ballot, even though the initial 2018 kind of polling had been much more favorable to that. So I want to get into here just talking quickly about what the outcomes of this, the sort of results of it in terms of the revenue, what have been some of the investments, and what has been the story in terms of retention or not of the tax base. So getting into the revenue, the tax has been, in the next slide, please, has been a real unqualified success. You can see in yellow what the budgeted amounts are. The budget amounts, there was none for the first year, the 2013, our year starts sort of the tax year, the July before. But so the 2023 tax year, there was just a little bit from some estimated tax payments. FY24 was really the first complete year. And people were scared of what the opponents to it had said. They had said that it wasn't going to produce the money that people had promised for it because the millionaires were going to leave, or we're going to find other ways to avoid taxes, or other kinds of measures. The official estimate was 1.4 billion in the voter's guide for it, and they only budgeted 1 billion in that from this money for fiscal year 2024. And as you can see here, it was about 2.4 billion, so more than doubled what had been budgeted for it. It was a kind of unqualified success. And then, there's a lot of people who said, well, okay, it's just going to take people another year to flee. Well, now that they see that this is really serious and that this has passed. But fiscal year 2025, they budgeted a little bit more, 1.3 billion, but the actual revenues were over $3 billion dollars from this new surtax. And now we're in fiscal year 2026, and we don't they've budgeted now they've budgeted there a little over 2.4 billion, and we don't know what the eventual revenue total would be, but we know that for the first 6 months of the year, the total, and it's as folks may know, revenue isn't evenly distributed across the year. But looking at the same period the previous year, we're 22% ahead of where we were the previous year. So if that pattern would continue, we would be, 22% ahead of the 3 billion that we collected last year. And the legislature is already budgeting 2.7 billion for fiscal year 2027. So yes, not beginner's luck. It has, from a revenue point of view, been just a really clear success. And we'll talk about what that means also as we reflect upon the retention of the tax base. But in the next slide, I want to talk about the investments. And this graphic is from the governor's, the official Massachusetts website. There'll be a link to it at the end, which really outlines in detail what has happened as a result of this money. I think, in really broad brush for education, it allowed the legislature to ramp up a $1.5 billion commitment to increase K-12 spending by $1.5 billion, a commitment that had been made shortly before the Fair Share Amendment, but which people had real doubts whether the legislature could ever come through with such a commitment, and they did. And then the some of the
Hi, Phineas. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I think we're having some technical difficulties hearing you. Okay, let's see. We'll just wait 30 seconds to see if Phineas um uh okay, I think it may be frozen at the time being. Um all right, so we'll see if kind of Phineas is able to come back. Otherwise, we will be sharing these slides out at the end and the resources that Phineas has shared with us. Overall, it just seems to be an overwhelming success in terms of how much they raised and where they were able to invest it. And so, Kate, can we get to the next slide? I'm not sure if Phineas has dropped out at the moment, but just the one thing that I was going to discuss that I think if he's able to hop back on, he might be able to elaborate on further is just um, there's been new census data to show that the number of millionaires in the state has actually increased since the passage of the millionaires tax, which I think mitigates the fear of tax or wealth flight because of these taxes. And so obviously, we would like to see this from kind of, oh, there you are, Phineas. Do you want to maybe touch on this slide and then we get to the questions? Oh, Phineas, you're on mute.
Gosh, okay, sorry. So we can talk more about the various investments later if folks want. Just a lot of things addressing affordability, like free school meals for everybody, free community college for everybody, free fares on all the buses outside of the Boston area, all kinds of other results in early child care, et cetera. But really getting to this issue, which is a major kind of opposition argument to it about retention of the tax base. And the final this next slide here is, we've already talked about the amazing sort of better than expected revenue growth, which in some ways is the most conclusive uh, indicator that people haven't fled because they are still around writing the checks to the Department of Revenue. And we know that up into kind of current year data. But because there's so much sort of noise about this, we'll mention also there wasn't the kind of exit this from wealthy enclaves that was expected, for sale signs everywhere in the richest neighborhoods. The census data continue to show slow but steady population growth more generally. And the IRS data allow us to see that the net outmigration in terms of the dollar migration, and there's problems the way that gets measured, but that it's actually less after the millionaire's tax. So not what you'd expect if you were going to see this creating a great exodus, and that of those people who did leave the state, that 9 in 10 of them had incomes under $200,000. So insofar as there is a outmigration problem in Massachusetts, it's more about our affordability, that we have some of the most expensive real estate in particular. It's housing is more expensive than anywhere, rents more than anywhere than California. And that's really what drives out migration from us. And the folks who are writing the checks are still there writing the checks. So I will stop there. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. I'll just note this last slide, and I think this will be available to people. You can find both on our website a lot of information addressing some of the arguments and counter arguments, addressing the kind of tax incidents of this, comparisons to other states, review of the data on migration, and tracking some of the investments. You can see from the state website a really thorough kind of and user accessible kind of tracking of what the investments have done in all kinds of different areas. And then I also included the campaign's website about it as well, if folks are interested in there. But I want to stop there. And I'm sorry again for the technical problems.
All good. I just first of all want to thank both you and Ryan for presenting today. It was incredibly insightful, and I know that maybe our folks will have some questions as well. If you have a question, feel free to pop it in the chat.